Now that we've looked at a market equilibrium and we've talked through those laws of supply and demand, we're going to look at a concept called a market distortion. So what is a market distortion? This would be anything that would intervene in a market in order to set a price outside of those laws of supply and demand. And we can see an example of these kinds of distortions when the government imposes a price floor or a price ceiling. So a price floor would be the minimum amount at which a producer can sell their product when the government sets this minimum amount. And a price ceiling would be the opposite. It would be when the government sets a maximum amount, a maximum dollar value that a producer can sell their product. So let's look at an example of what would happen in a market if the government were to impose a price floor. We'll start with the market for soybeans. We can see over here in the left in this market, we have a demand curve and a supply curve that intersect at a price of $2.50 per pound of soybeans. At this price, the equilibrium quantity demanded and supplied is 800 pounds of soybeans. So what would happen if the government were to impose a price floor of $3.50 per pound? At this higher price for soybeans, producers would be incentivized to produce a higher quantity of soybeans. So at equilibrium, they're producing 800 pounds of soybeans, but now the producers are seeing potential to make more money, to increase their profits. 350 is $1 higher than the previous, equilibrium price. And so now they're going to try and earn more money by making more of this product. But the demanders on the other hand, will be de-incentivized to purchase this product at a higher price, therefore reducing the quantity demanded to 400 pounds of soybeans. So why might that be? Maybe at this higher price of soybeans, maybe consumers of soybeans will seek alternative products. Maybe they'll say, for instance, corn. Maybe consumers will find as much satisfaction in purchasing corn as they did in soybean, or maybe a good enough satisfaction, and maybe they'll save some money by producing a substitute product at a lower price. So at this higher price of $3.50, we have less quantity of soybeans demanded than we have produced. So that results in a market surplus. When the amount of a product being produced is higher than the amount that the market is demanding, we have excess of this product, which results in a surplus. So in a situation without a price floor, if the price of a product were above the equilibrium, market forces would drive that price back down to this equilibrium point. And the price and quantity would always shift until the market gets back into that equilibrium. So without a price floor, you have this fluid market in which things are shifting in order to get back to that equilibrium point. But this price floor is limiting the market's ability to shift based on those laws of supply and demand. So now that the market cannot sell soybeans for any lower, we just result in a misallocation of resources, which would be this price floor. But it's important to remember that price floor that is set above the equilibrium point is going to result in a surplus. A price floor set below the equilibrium point, on the other hand, is not necessarily going to result in a surplus. Why might that be? If the government were to impose a price floor of $1.50, remember this is the minimum legal point at which a good or service can be sold. So there's nothing stopping the market from charging more than $1.50. They simply just can't charge less. So because the equilibrium point for soybeans, or equilibrium price for soybeans, is higher than the $1.50 price floor, nothing changes. Producers will still sell the higher equilibrium, sell the product at the higher equilibrium price. Therefore, the quantity demanded and supplied will be 800, and the market will sit in equilibrium. So if a price floor is set below the market equilibrium point, it doesn't change anything. But if it's set above, it results in a surplus. Another example of a price floor, a really common example, which you're probably all familiar with, would be the minimum wage rate. So let's look at an example. In the labor for market, this can get a little tricky. So let's start with identifying our supply and demand curves. In the market, in the labor for market, market for labor, a demand curve would be represented by labor demanders. So that would be employers, any kind of company that's looking to hire laborers. So the supply curve, on the other hand, would be represented by those supplying the labor. So people willing to work, people in the labor force would be the supply curve. So in this example that we have here, we can see that the equilibrium point of the market for labor would be a wage rate of $9 per hour. And at this rate, we have 75 million people who are willing to work. So 75 million people supplied. And we also have 75 million people demanded. So this is a simplified version, but let's just keep going. So if the government were to impose a minimum wage of $12 an hour, what would happen? Well, at the higher price, we can see that the suppliers of labor, those looking for jobs, would increase from 75 million people to 100 million people. Why might that be? Well, at the higher wage rate, there might be people who now look at a job and say, it's worth it to me to work at that higher rate. At $9 an hour, maybe, let's say like a stay-at-home mom, for instance. Maybe at $9 an hour, it wasn't worth it to her to go out and get a job because her leaving the house means she has to pay a babysitter, and maybe the cost of childcare just didn't offset at that $9 an hour rate. At the $12 an hour rate, maybe she looks at that job and says, well, now I can pay for daycare and still earn a little bit more, so now the job's worth it. So we can see at the higher wage rate, suppliers are incentivized to increase their quantity. More people are willing to work, so we have more people join the labor force. But what happens on the demander side? At that higher price, it costs employers more to produce their product. Because remember, labor is an input of a product, so it's an expense to businesses in order to achieve that product they're looking for. And at this higher expense, employers might look for alternative solutions. Maybe they'll try and automate some tasks, or maybe they'll try to find some efficiencies somewhere in order to have less employees to complete more work. So in order to save costs, laborers will decrease the number of jobs, employers will decrease the number of jobs in the market. So in this case, the result of the minimum wage is more people joining the labor force, more people looking for jobs, but less jobs available. which results in a surplus, which is also known as unemployment. So when there's less jobs than there are people in the labor force, we have unemployment. So this misallocation